This video was originally going to be about both Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two of the first women accused of witchcraft in Salem. But I started doing my notes, and I've got 8 pages of notes just about Sarah Good. So we're only going to talk about her tonight. Sarah started off well enough. She came from not a wealthy family, but kind of a middle-class family, I guess you might say, a family of farmers. But she had brothers and sisters. Everything was going well. But when she was 18, her father committed suicide by drowning himself. This put the family into some debt, but her mother remarried. And when she remarried, everything that was going to be left to the children actually went to the stepfather. The stepfather was not completely cold-hearted. He said, "I understand, children, you expect your inheritance, and now I am basically the executor of the will, so I will decide how it shall be split up, and here's what you get, here's what you get, here's what you get." What he offered them was less than their fair share. So it should be divided by the number of children that the father probably would have left them. That's not what the stepfather was offering. And the children wrangled this for about 10 years before it was finally settled. Sarah married for the first time. She was pretty young. She married a man named Daniel Poole. Daniel Poole, he went to town and got himself a couple new suits and some petticoats for Sarah. And he had this debt, and then he promptly died. So to cover the cost of his funeral, Sarah had to sell all of her movables, which meant basically like everything that she owned, all her furniture and all that kind of stuff. She had to sell all of that stuff just to get out of debt for the funeral. This is not bewitched. This does not include the debt to the tailor that was also owed. So soon after this, Sarah marries a second time, this time to a man named William Good. And it's around this time that she settles the debt with her stepfather. Not the debt, but the inheritance with her stepfather. And she ends up taking the offer that he initially made, which was for less than her fair share. And it was basically like a meadow somewhere. And so they're like, okay, well, we're going to live here on this meadow and we're going to make a new life for ourselves and we'll see what happens. But what happened was the tailor, who the first husband owed debt to, sued the now Mrs. Good, Goody Good, and her husband, William Good, for the debt run up by the first husband. So they basically had to sell off some of Sarah's inheritance, some of the land that she had finally inherited after all these years, to cover the cost of the tailor debt. So now she's in double debt, and the news gets worse for Sarah Good because her new husband, William Good, was not much of a provider. He was a weaver by trade, but it seems that he had a very hard time finding employment, even as a laborer. And you would think, as a young man in a village full of farms, that this would not be so hard to come by. Maybe it was laziness on his part. Maybe he was shiftless. Who knows? We don't know what, but William Good does not seem to have been a very good provider. You're going to hear lots of word play and puns like that. I don't think you can call it really either of those. It's not clever enough. But their name's Good. It's gonna happen a lot. By the way, a note about terminology. You heard me refer to her as Goody Good. This was short for Good Wife Good. And this was a term that Puritans used, but you might just think like that's what they said, sir or ma'am. Sir or ma'am was replaced by Goody Good, Good Wife Good, Good Man, Proctor, whatever. Actually, that was kind of like a signal that you were lower class. If you were a more respected member of the community, you were a Miss or Mr. But if you were like kind of on the lower rung socially, then you would be Goodman or Good Wife, Goody. So we see that Sarah Good was a goody. Okay, so they sold the land to cover the debt run up by her first husband, and eventually, because William Good, again, was not such a great provider, they ended up selling most of the land that they owned, or I think all of it, basically, by the end of that summer. This is 1683. They have their first child, Dorcas, born in 1688. Dorcas is going to figure in prominently during the witch trials. It's not going to be a fun story, just a heads up. Now, with this child in tow, things went from bad to worse for the Good family, because now they had another mouth to feed. And it's during this time that they became homeless. They went to their family members and neighbors, but people really didn't want to take them in. We don't know what the Goods looked like, but we can assume that there was something foul about them. And I don't mean that, a condition they were born with. I mean that they were probably dirty. And we see many times in the record that people were afraid that they would be carrying critters or disease, such as smallpox. We know that Sarah Good smoked a pipe, and one of her relatives refused to let her stay. And then he was afraid that she would actually go out and sleep in the barn when nobody was looking. So he used to send his sons out on patrol to go make sure that she wasn't in there, mostly because he said he was afraid that she smoked like a chimney and she would start a fire when she was careless with her pipes in the barn. She did end up staying with the family of Mary Abbey, which was a neighbor of hers, and they let her stay for about 6 months, but eventually they kicked her out. And according to court records, they kicked her out for quietness' sake. They say that Sarah Good had quite a temper and she was always raising a ruckus, and eventually they just couldn't take it anymore and they kicked her out. This is a theme we see a lot with Sarah Good. She was not a popular person in town. A lot of people found her rather, like I said, unappealing, frightening maybe. She was also known to curse and mumble as she walked away from these homes where she felt she was ill-treated by her friends, neighbors, and family members. All of this would be very bad for her in the coming months. Now, they eventually found a small place to call home, but again, with the kid and William not being able to find very much work, if any work at all, Sarah took to begging. So she'd go house to house. She'd come up after meeting on a Saturday and ask for kindness from her neighbors for her child. She was always looking out for Dorcas, so she claimed. In December of 1691, just a few months before the breakout of the witchcraft allegations, Sarah Good had another baby. We don't know this baby's name. We know that it was a female, and it's just called Infant Good. That's all we know it as. It was also around this time, somewhere January, February of 1692. This is where she showed up on the doorstep of the parsonage, the home owned by Salem Village's minister, Reverend Paris. She was begging here for her daughter, and Reverend Paris gave her something for the child. Now, what happened next is up for debate, but Sarah Good seemed unimpressed by what Paris had offered the child, and she muttered something as they walked out. Now, a lot of people have said perhaps she so frightened the Paris children, the children in the household, which if you saw the last video, you'll know that is Abigail Williams, his niece, and his eldest daughter, Betty. So the theory goes that Sarah Good so frightened these children that this is when they begin having their fits. But actually, they were already having their fits before this event took place. But Reverend Paris does point out in court transactions later on that when Sarah Good left the home after muttering under her breath, he did not know what, that the girl's afflictions became much worse. Now, the last video was all about how the afflictions started and what series of events might have kicked off the immediate witchcraft hysteria. So go back and watch that video if you have not. But I'm going to assume that you know that there was a witchcraft hysteria in Salem, Massachusetts, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. So, Sarah Good is one of the first women accused, and she is accused by the two young girls mentioned earlier, Abigail Williams and Betty Paris. But there are other children involved too, because Elizabeth Hubbard, the niece of the doctor who declared that Abigail and Betty were under an evil hand, she became one of the first afflicted girls from outside of the Paris household, and she said that now that she thinks about it, she remembers a time when she was followed home by a wolf one night. And she said that this wolf was either sent by Sarah Good or Sarah Good herself in disguise. So now on February 29th, 1692, Thomas Putnam and his little company of merry men, trust me, we're going to talk about the Putnams quite a bit in future videos. They go off to the magistrates in Salem town to file an official legal complaint. And this is the first time it's happened. We've heard the allegations of witchcraft. We've heard suspicions. There's been talk in the town. There's been an incident with a witch cake. But this is the first time that they're making like a legal issue out of it, which is a big deal because witchcraft is a federal offense and it is something that is punishable by death. So complaints are filed against Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good. And these magistrates decide, okay, we're going to take these women in, we're going to examine them and see if there's enough evidence to put them on trial. Also, it was a little bit of a sticky situation because technically there was no local government at this time. They were waiting for a new charter, and I could probably bore most of you with charter talk, but basically just know that Massachusetts had lost its charter, so basically there were no laws per se that could be governed by the people living in Massachusetts. It all had to go back to England. A new charter's on its way. It's going to be here in a couple months, but it's not here yet. So technically, they can't hold trials, which is why we don't see the actual trials start until a few months later. But they can have hearings with the local magistrates, which is what we're having right now. So, the day after the complaint was filed, March 1st, 1692, Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good are brought together to Ingersoll's Ordinary. This is what you would call an inn and a tavern today, and that might sound a little weird to you if you think of Puritans as like stuffy, uptight people who don't indulge in fun. That image is not exactly true. It's partially true. They were against a lot of things. They did consider most things that were fun, if not a sin in and of themselves, at least a temptation to sin. You're basically taking your eyes off the prize, and the prize is living a good, godly life to show that you're a saint, to show that you're a member of the church, to show that you're one of the elect, so that you will have a higher likelihood of being one of the people chosen to go to heaven. But they did allow certain things, and drinking alcohol was not frowned upon. You know, it was still bad to be drunk. They didn't care for that, but you could go and have a few drinks and it was no big deal. In fact, most people did after meeting or before meeting, and Ingersoll's was just down the street from the meeting house. So they were also, these inns were also used commonly for meetings and government meetings and public meetings, all kinds of things. So this was a convenient spot, but it was so crowded at Ingersoll's because the whole town had heard, should say the whole village had heard that this was going to be happening, and they'd all known about the girls' afflictions. They knew the women involved. These were their neighbors. This was a village of only about 500 people. So everybody knew about it. It was a big deal in town, and everybody wanted to see what was going on. They heard about the afflicted girls. They heard about the witches. They wanted to see the girls twitch and writhe and name their accusers. They wanted to see these accused witches. Everybody wanted to see it. The women are examined for witch marks, or witches' teats. These are marks that people believed the devil would leave on his witches, and the witch teats were something that they would suckle their familiar with. Now, their familiar was not a flesh and blood creature like we might think of, but this would be like a witch's little helper, basically. And you might think of it as like a black cat. You know, we think of the witch with the black cat. That cats are involved in the witch trials, but they're not one of the most common animals cited. They much more often preferred birds and toads. And another interesting note here is that the devil's color back in this day, we might think of maybe black or red as being the devil's color, but back in 1692, the devil's color was yellow. So a lot of these animals were yellow birds, yellow snakes, yellow toads. So anyway, yes, Ingersoll's wife, Hannah, is the one who does the examinations. And she looks over these witches and she doesn't see any unusual marks, scars, protuberances, anything like that. But then William Good shows up. This is the husband of Sarah Good. And he helpfully points out that he saw an unusual mark on his wife's right shoulder blade the other night, which had never been there before. And he just wanted to make sure that Hannah Ingersoll had noted it. What a helpful guy. He gets more helpful as we go on. So now the magistrates arrive at Ingersoll's tavern. This is Judge Hathorne and Judge Corwin. But once they get there, they realize this place is too small. The whole town had showed up. I shouldn't say town, I should say village, because Salem town, Salem village, different places. So he realizes, the judges realize the venue is too small, basically. The whole village has come out. It's 500 people, and they're not going to fit in Ingersoll's tavern. So he says, okay, let's take this down the road a little bit, just a few blocks away, to the meeting house. The meeting house is what we might now call church, but church meant something different to the Puritans. I went over all this in the last video about what started the witch hysteria, so refer back to that. But basically, they called their churches meeting house. And this is where these first examinations were set to take place. The accused witches were brought in together, and they heard the opening prayers and the opening remarks together, but they were examined separately, and only one of the accused witches was allowed in the building at a time. However, all of the accusing girls, the afflicted, and they were all still young girls at this point, were in the building the entire time. Sarah Good becomes the first woman to be examined officially for witchcraft, and you can see right away when she walks into the room, the girls begin having their fits. They calm down as the judges prepare to start questioning Sarah Good. Now, I don't have the trial examination transcript memorized, so I'm going to have to read that to you. Luckily, I have it right here in this very book, The Salem Witch Trials. This is the big, they call this one the big book in town. And this is a kind of a day-by-day book. And it's really well done, really well researched. It's a bit voluminous, as you can see. So this is for if you're like seriously interested in the witch trials, this is definitely a book you want to get. If you just want to learn like a little bit, then maybe go with one of the other ones. But if you want the deep dive, this is a good book. Okay, so we can see right away from the way Hathorne asked the questions, there is a presumption of guilt here. It's not like a regular examination or hearing or even a questioning that we might have today. You'll also notice there's no lawyers present. That's because, again, they're kind of making up their own rules of law at this point, but also because the crime of witchcraft, they thought, well, if the person didn't do it, all they need to do is be honest. And their honesty will win the day. And also, the Lord would not let someone who was not guilty be found guilty. The Lord would find a way to reveal it. So they basically don't need a lawyer. They just need to be able to tell the truth. So as long as they tell the truth, there's not going to be any problems. That turns out to be wrong. So we begin the examination. Hathorne begins. Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? None. Have you made no contract with the devil? No. Why do you hurt these children? I do not hurt them. I scorn it. Well, who do you employ to hurt them then? I employ nobody. What creature do you employ to hurt them? No creature, but I am falsely accused. And it's at this point that Reverend Paris chirps up and says, I sent her away after she was like begging from me, and she walked away muttering under her breath. She was probably like saying a curse or something, because Betty and Abigail, they got like way worse after she left. They started having their fits and everything, got way worse. So I think that, you know, she must have done something when she was walking away, because I didn't give her daughter enough gold or something. So Hathorn turns to Sarah Good and he says, Sarah Good, what did you say when you were walking away from Reverend Paris's house? And to be honest, Sarah Good probably doesn't remember. Or maybe she did say something nasty and she just doesn't want to say it in court. Or to her, it was just a moment. It wasn't like a big thing that she needed to remember. And she just says, oh, I thanked him for what he gave to my daughter. And they let it go at that. For a moment, they're going to come back around to it. Hathorn next tells the girls to look at Sarah Good and make sure that this is the woman that they see in their visions. This is the specter that comes to torment them late at night and pinches them and bites them sometimes and all this kind of nasty stuff and makes it so they can't hear prayers. And this is one of the people they've been hiding from for these past 2 months. The girls look at them and say, yeah, that's the woman. She was torturing us all these past 2 months. And in fact, she came this morning and tortured us. And that's when, you know, Sarah Good's like, but I've been in custody all morning. I've been with the sheriff and the jailers all morning. How could I have hurt these children? And that's when we find out about specters. Now, a specter is not exactly like your spirit. In fact, what is a specter is a very, very good question, and one that they would have been a little bit hard-pressed to answer in 1692. It's one of those things, I might not be able to define a specter, but I know one when I see one. They probably wouldn't have said it with that accent, but that's basically kind of what the story is with the specters. There's a lot of debate, even in 1692, as to what a specter is. Is it perhaps the shell of your spirit leaving your body, being sucked out by your familiar or by the devil himself? Is that what the witch's teats are for? Could the devil take the shape of a person with or without their consent? That was a big contentious point in 1692. But the main thing to keep in mind is that your specter was basically what we might think of as your spirit, your ghost, coming out of your body and in your shape, in your form, looking very much like the real you, going and tormenting people, but only can be seen by the people that you're tormenting. Although sometimes they can't be seen by the people that they're tormenting. The rules for specters are fast and loose, as we're going to discover throughout the trial. So yeah, the girls said that, you know, they had been tormented that morning. And Sarah Good says, I have not been anywhere near them anytime, let alone this morning. And when she denies this, the girls start to have their fits again. So Hathorn says, Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you torment these poor children? She says, I do not torment them. So he asks, well, who do you employ then? And she says, I employ no one. I scorn it. Well, how come they thus tormented? What do I know? You bring others here, and now you charge me with it. This Hathorn picks up on. He says, why? Who was it? Because she just said, hey, you brought other people here, and you're saying I did it. But there's other people that you brought in. Now she just means, like, why are you blaming me? If you brought these 2 other people, it's probably one of them. But he's doing kind of a sneaky, slippery, lawyery trick. For someone who, by the way, who has no legal education, this is pretty sneaky. Pretty sneaky. I got a spoon in my hand. The girls cried out that it was Sarah Good who did it, and Sarah Good says, I don't know who did it, but you brought other people into the meeting house with me, and so maybe it was one of them. And Hathorn says, yeah, we brought you into the meeting house. That wasn't as clever a lawyery trick. And she says, but you brought 2 more. So Hathorn asks, well then who is it that torments these children? Now she's already been through this a couple times. So now she's going to change her answer. She's going to say something that she thinks the judge wants to hear. So if she must name a name, fine, she's going to name a name. So she says, it was Goody Osborne. Now, why would she say Goody Osborne? Well, Osborne is one of the women brought in with her, but there's also a good chance that she didn't know Tituba's name. Tituba was a slave, so it's not like they'd be hanging out, you know. Even Sarah Good, who is the lowest rung of society, she's not a slave, so she's probably considered, in fact, we'll know from comments she makes later on, she considers herself well above Tituba. So she might not even know Tituba's name. So why does she name Sarah Osborne? Is it because she really thinks she's a witch? No, probably not. It's because she probably knew Sarah Osborne, at least a little bit. In fact, Osborne will say as much later on. They weren't friends or anything, but they knew each other from town. Now, the judge asked the girls to clarify. He says, now she says that Sarah Osborne's the one doing this. And the girls say, yeah, Sarah Osborne is, but also Sarah Good and Tituba, and also Sarah Good. Now, Judge Hathorn brings up the point that she has not attended church, in quite some time. And Sarah Good says, this is true, but it's only true because I don't have clothes fine enough to go to meeting. She was, after all, a beggar woman. We don't know for sure, but her first husband died after going in debt to the tailor. So it's possible, if not necessarily probable, that those 2 petticoats that he bought for her were the last bit of new clothing that she has had, unless she got some hand-me-down from neighbors or something. So she says that she didn't look good enough to go to church, and that's why she hasn't been. Now they return to the night that she showed up on Reverend Paris's door, and he asks her again, what did you say when you were leaving Reverend Paris's household? And Sarah Good says, if I must tell you, I will. I was saying my commandments. I hope I may say my commandments. And Judge Hathorn says, okay, go ahead then, repeat the commandments for us. And she is unable to do so. So she says, well, you know, maybe it wasn't the commandments. I was saying a psalm. So Judge Hathorn says, okay, well, what psalm was it? Tell us the psalm. And she starts to mumble one, but she can't get all the way through it. She doesn't remember all the words. So we know she's not strong in her religious teachings. Now, Ezekiel Cheever was the court reporter on this day, and he's the one writing the notes. In his notes, he basically stops taking an exact transcription of what Sarah Good was saying, which he had been doing up until this point, and he just wrote that she answers in a wicked and spiteful manner with base and abusive words and many lies. Now, we don't know, because he didn't write it down, exactly what these lies were, but based on what's been said before, unless you actually believe she was a witch, which I do not, these were probably not so much lies as they were her just trying to think of a way out of what was happening to her. Again, a lot of these incidents that they're bringing up, they probably weren't a big deal to her at the time. And like, as she was walking away, maybe, yeah, she mumbled something about like, you're a jerk or something like that. Maybe a little stronger, who knows. But the point is, she wasn't like practicing witchcraft, right? There was nothing satanic in what she was doing. She was just known to be an ill-tempered lady. So if she was begging and she didn't feel like they gave enough, yeah, she probably said something not so nice as she walked away. But does that mean that she's made a satanic compact and signed the devil's book? Now her husband, William Good, is brought in for questioning. And he says that, you know, I don't know if my wife is a witch, but I fear that she might be. And if she's not at this very moment, I'm afraid that she will soon become one. And Hathorn says, what are you talking about? Be specific. Have you seen her performing acts of witchcraft? And he says, no, I've never seen her perform witchcraft, but she's really, really mean to me. At this point, he begins weeping, and he declares his wife an enemy to all good. Again, kind of a play on the name, but also good. I didn't do that one. That was William Good. Don't blame me. So that's the end of Sarah Good's hearing. Hathorne decides, okay, we're going to hold her for trial, and we're going to bring her to jail. Now, they decide to send her to jail in Ipswich. Sarah Osborne and Tituba are sent to jail in Salem, but Sarah Good, they decide she's going to go over to Ipswich, but she's not going to go that very day. She's going to stay with one of the marshals there overnight. So she's let out of court, and Sarah Osborne is questioned next, and she denies all allegations, even when the judges point out that Sarah Good had named her as the witch who was hurting the children, although as we saw, she didn't really exactly say like, oh, it was definitely Sarah Osborne, but anyway. Even then, Sarah Osborne doesn't turn around and say, no, it was Sarah Good, or confess or anything like that. Tituba, on the other hand, who will definitely get her own video, she says that she denies it at first, but like very quickly turns it around and says, hey, you know what? Yes, I performed witchcraft. I was in league with the devil against my will, but he threatened to behead me several times if I didn't do what he wanted me to do. She tells this whole elaborate story. Again, we're going to cover it in another video, and goes on and on describing this deal with the devil. And she says, yes, Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good were already in the company of the devil when he came to me. These are witches. We're all three witches. I'm the only one that's going to tell you the truth about it, so better keep me alive so I can testify against these two. And that's exactly what ends up happening. So Osborne and Tituba are held in Salem jail. Good is going to be sent to Ipswich, but for now, she's going to spend the night in Salem Village under the guard of Joseph Herrick, who was a constable. And also, she was like related to him somehow. I'm unclear as to how the family tree falls, but they were actually related to each other. The daughter Dorcas is left with the father, William Good, which is dubious at best because we know what kind of gentleman he's been so far. Now, during this night, several Salem villagers claim to have very frightening encounters with either Sarah Good herself or at least the specter of Sarah Good. This includes a couple gentlemen who are walking home from a tavern at night when they see an unidentifiable creature in the middle of the road. This creature stands and turns into the three women that they'd seen in court that day, or at the examination that day. And of course, one of these is Sarah Good. This very same night, Elizabeth Hubbard, the niece of Dr. Griggs, living with Dr. Griggs, claimed that she had a visitation from Sarah Good. She said, while there were visitors in the house, Elizabeth Hubbard begins to have her fits again, and she cries out, "There stands Sarah Good, right there on the table in front of you, with her breast bare, and her legs bare, and her feet bare. Oh, nasty slut! If I had something, I would kill you." When she says this, one of the visitors, a man by the name of Samuel Sibley, husband of Mary Sibley, of witch cake fame, we'll get to it, he jumps up and with his walking stick, he swipes at the air. Now Elizabeth Hubbard sees this and she says, "Oh good, you've struck her. In fact, you've nearly killed her by hitting her across the back with your walking stick." Meanwhile, this very same night, over at Constable Herrick's farm, there are guards left to be in charge of watching Sarah Good. Joseph Herrick is asleep in bed. So the guards are watching Sarah Good, but they're not keeping a constant eye on her. They just kind of go out and check on her every once in a while. Well, one of these times when they go out, they find that she is gone. And so, by the way, is her infant daughter, who was sent to jail with her for some reason. I forgot to mention that part. Dorcas was sent back with the dad, but the infant Sarah kept. Maybe she insisted upon it. I'm not sure. But she kept that one with her. So now she is on the run, and she split so fast she didn't take her shoes or her stockings. This is probably because she only had a very brief window of time to try to escape when the guards weren't watching her. So the guards are debating what to do and probably begin a little bit of a search. But Massachusetts in March, and this was supposed to be an especially harsh winter, barefoot and carrying a baby, Sarah Good didn't get too far, and she realized that her escape attempt was basically doomed. So she said, fine, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to the Herrick's farm and turn myself in. So she does that, much to the relief of the guards, but she was gone for some time during the night. So now, the next day, all these reports of seeing Sarah Good they have a little bit more credibility to them because the guards don't know where she was during this time. So were they really seeing Sarah Good? Were they seeing her specter? When she returns to Constable Herrick's farm, they notice a wound. She's bleeding from the wrist to the elbow. And when they bring this up later on, they say, aha, so Miss Hubbard's report was correct. They did hit her with the walking stick, and this is what caused her wound. Never mind that Hubbard had said the blow landed on her back, and never mind that Sarah Good had been presumably traipsing through the wilderness and probably cut herself that way. So now it's the next day, March 2nd, 1692, and it's noon. This is around the time where guard Samuel Braybrook arrives to transport the prisoner, Sarah Good, from Salem Village to Ipswich Jail. This is about a 3-hour ride on horseback, and during this time, Sarah Good tries to escape 3 separate times by jumping off the back of this horse. And each time she did, the guardsman Braybrook would have to jump off and pursue her and wrestle her back onto the horse. She also declares that she will never confess and that there's no proof against her except for the word of an Indian slave. So she's definitely not going to be convicted. But she must have been scared enough because she keeps trying to escape with her daughter clutched to her chest, her infant daughter. And also, Braybrook reports that she attempted to kill herself. We don't know if this was a separate act. He doesn't describe how or when she tried to kill herself. It could just be that he means that her repeatedly jumping off the horse seemed suicidal to him. So we don't know for sure. A few days later, on March 5th, Good is returned for more questioning, and the magistrates are questioning her in jail, but she is still saying, I am innocent of witchcraft, and nothing you're going to say is going to change that. So she spends her time now between the Salem jail and also Boston jail. She gets sent to Boston for a while too. About midway through the end of the month, towards the end of the month, Dorcas Good is also accused of being a witch. This is the 4 or 5-year-old daughter that we spoke of earlier, and she is accused by the afflicted girls. We really don't know why, aside from the fact that she was this low-class person's daughter. Maybe Dorcas was a little bit scary in and of herself. Maybe the girls were jealous that she was still so very young and able to be a child when they were expected to be women, full-grown women, basically by the age of 7 or 8, working on the farm and doing household chores. They weren't allowed to go and play and be innocent children. Or maybe it was just the cruelty of young people. We know, there's a reason why these middle school stories are so terrible, these bullying stories all the time. So maybe this was basically an extreme case of bullying. So she's accused. She's brought in for questioning, and after some time, she confesses to being a witch because she's a 5-year-old girl standing in front of these magistrates who are super powerful people, not from her own village, but from the fancy town down the way. So this is like a big deal. So she's probably eager to please and very much afraid. So she's agreeing to what they are saying. And she ends up saying, yeah, I'm a witch. My mom made me a witch. I have a familiar. It's a yellow snake. He suckles me here from the lowest joint of my pinky finger. She showed that there seemed to be a little red mark. It looked like a flea bite, but she said, no, this is where I suck over my familiars. And Hathorne says, and the devil gave you this familiar, this yellow snake? And she says, no, my mom did. So now we're getting evidence from Dorcas against her own mother, Sarah Good. And during this examination, some of the afflicted girls say that Dorcas was sending out her specter to bite them even as she's standing there in the courtroom, and they showed their arms, and they had, in fact, what the court papers describe as little bite marks, presumably too small for the girls themselves to have made, so it must have been Dorcas's specter who was sent forth, even in front of everybody, to bite these afflicted girls. On March 31st, 1692, Abigail Williams, the 11-year-old niece of Reverend Parris, the very first girl we believe to be afflicted in town, says that she witnessed 40 witches and the devil celebrating a black mass in the pasture outside of Reverend Parris's home. This was held on the day that Salem Village was fasting to hopefully bring about the end of this witchcraft hysteria in town. And this was basically like a parody of the fast. The villagers, the saintly villagers would fast, and the witches and the devil would feast. Abigail says at this festival, they drank red liquid that looked not like wine, so possibly blood. They ate red bread, and they ate raw red meat. She said she couldn't identify all the witches that were there, but definitely Sarah Good was one of the satanic deacons at this black mass. And it's around this time that Sarah Good's infant daughter, the one we don't know the name of, this infant daughter dies in prison. Sarah Good's trial began on June 28th at 9 a.m. Now this, unlike before, where we just had a hearing and examination, this was a real honest-to-goodness trial before the real judges, Judge Stoughton and the rest. We'll do another whole video perhaps about the judges. They are an important and key group within the witchcraft trials, of course, and that's another group that you really don't hear all that much about. So we definitely want to try to cover them in a future video. Now, the trial began with the neighbors who had taken in Sarah Good from time to time, giving their reports about what a vile person she was, basically, and how they just couldn't stand to be with her. They were afraid of her. She had a violent temper. She was dirty. She was not a good Christian woman. Other neighbors say that their cow died shortly after one of her visits, and William Good went and told his wife that the neighbor's cows had died, and Sarah Good's response was, I don't care if all their cows die. And of course, William Good himself was the one who volunteered that information because he's just been super helpful in the prosecution of his wife. So other evidence that we have against her are, like we said, her husband's own words, Dorcas's words, her daughter, her very own daughter testifying against her, reports of her malicious specter from villagers and the afflicted girls. So like we talked about the villagers that said they saw her in the night, the afflicted girls were saying, yes, she tormented us all these months. She's still tormenting us now. She could even be doing it at very moments in the trials when the girls would begin to erupt in a frenzy. One of the afflicted girls jumped up, claiming that Sarah Good's specter had just attempted to stab her in the breast with a knife. And she even held up a piece of a broken blade. She said the blade had broken off in the attempted stabbing. Now, obviously, the whole court was shocked by this moment, but a young man stands up and he says, wait a minute, I know where that knife came from. I was outside the other day with some of the afflicted standing nearby, and my knife broke. And I threw the broken piece away, and I just put the rest of it in my pocket to get rid of later, but it's actually still in my jacket pocket, and I have it right here. So he brings it forward, and the judges compare the broken piece of metal with the broken knife, and it fits perfectly. Now, you might think that this unidentified afflicted girl was then sent out of court for lying, and maybe they would realize the whole witch trial was built on lies. That's not at all what happened. What actually happened was the judge admonished the afflicted girl and said, "Don't lie." And she returned to her space in the court, and the trial continued. I should also note that that story does not come from the official court records. That comes from someone writing about the trials after the trials who was clearly against the trials. So, a little bit apocryphal, but possible. So the trial concludes when Sarah Good is found guilty and sentenced to hang to death until dead. On the morning of July 17th, Sheriff George Corwin transported Sarah Good and 4 other convicted witches by cart to the place of execution. Now, during an execution, normally what would happen is the convicted would come to terms with the fact that they were going to die, and they a lot of times would kind of get into what you might call a Zen mode, where they're reflective and they are either asking forgiveness if they feel that there is something that they have done to be sorry for, or they're offering forgiveness to those who persecute them at the very least. Sarah Good was not like this at all. Salem town's minister, Reverend Noyes, urged Sarah Good to confess to what the courts had seemingly already proved, that she was a witch. This way, she would die at the very least not being a liar. Sarah Good was not having any of this. She said, "Look, I am not a witch, and I'm not going to say that I am a witch." Reverend Noyes was angered by this, and he said, "I know you are a witch." And she said, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take my life from me, God will give you blood to drink." And so she was hanged. So now we have to wonder what happened after. Well, nothing happened to Sarah Good. She was dead and gone. But what happened to Dorcas and her husband, William? On December 10th, 1692, a good Samaritan by the name of Samuel Ray of Salem town basically bailed 5-year-old Dorcas out of jail. The witch trials were still kind of in effect at this time, although they put a stop to arresting anybody new, and they'd put a stop to the executions, and most of the people who were accused were being let out of jail, and then once they were out, they didn't really go through the trouble of bringing them back in because things were kind of canceled by then. We'll get into all of that in a future video. But Dorcas was basically in jail because she couldn't afford to pay her way out, and also because she was like 5 at the time, and her father, William Good, proved to be useless even here too. So this 5-year-old girl had been in jail for this entire time. Now, this good neighbor, good Samaritan, bails her out, and unfortunately, the only place for her to go to is back to her father. But she is not the same child who entered the jail about 10 months earlier. When she went in, everyone agreed that she was, quote, as healthy and hearty as any other child. When she came out, she looked very sickly, and she was essentially mute. We don't know exactly the kind of horrors that Dorcas would have faced, but in jail, she was chained to a wall, kept with people who were accused of witchcraft, yes, but also other criminals that were in prison, pirates, thieves. And this is a poor 5-year-old girl. Even if she was imprisoned with her mother, it's not very likely that the mother was showing a ton of compassion to this child who had accused her of witchcraft and was going to be partly responsible for her mother's execution. So when she comes out, she basically had lost her mind. In 1710, we know that she had not recovered from the trauma she suffered in jail because her father seeks restitution, essentially. And restitution was something that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was offering in a somewhat limited capacity at this time because they started to realize, hey, you know what? Maybe we made a mistake here. And this is kind of fast forwarding to the end of our story, but overall, but we just want to focus on the Good's story. So there'll be a future video about what brought the trials to an end. But it's important to know that, yes, Dorcas was affected by this for the rest of her life. Her father shows up in court saying, I need to find someone to care for her. She can't govern herself. She can't be in charge of herself. She's not safe to leave alone. She's gone back to being like a toddler mentally, basically. So that's why I said Dorcas's story is especially sad. Yes, she turned on her mother, but can you blame a 4 or 5-year-old child when she's confronted with a room full of strangers, afflicted girls yelling at her, and these magistrates standing over her saying, tell us you're a witch, tell us your mother's a witch. It's not like she just, willfully turned on her mother or something like that. So that is the story of the Goods, the very sad story of the Good family. William Good, Dorcas Good, and Sarah Good, one of the first accused witches of the Salem Witch Trials. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please go to my GoFundMe and pledge a little donation there, even just $1. If everyone who watched this video gave $1, I would be so happy. GoFundMe.com/witchfinder20. Again, the reason I'm doing these videos is because I can't be out on the streets, street performing so much this year in Salem. And this is the way I'm trying to get at least just a tiny little bit of that money. Not much. I'm not looking for big bucks here, but just a little something. I'm not asking for something for nothing, because that's what I'm making these videos for, and I do hope that you find them. You can follow me on Instagram at Witchfinder of Salem. And until next time, beware! The Witchfinder is always watching. That's David Bowie. That's a David Bowie life cast, by the way. That's the answer to last week's question.